January 20th, 1953, marked the day when the bitter cold of Washington matched the chill between two men who should have been allies. Harry S. Truman stood on the steps of the Capitol watching Dwight D. Eisenhower take the oath of office. But the ceremony represented far more than a peaceful transfer of power. It symbolized the beginning of an 8-year silence that would keep a former president away from the house he once called home. The rupture began not with policy disagreements or political philosophy, but with something far more personal and unforgivable in Truman's eyes. During the 1952 campaign, Eisenhower had allowed his supporters to attack Truman's administration with unprecedented venom. The accusations of corruption, softness on communism, and mismanagement of the Korean War had stung deeply. But what wounded Truman most profoundly was Eisenhower's refusal to defend George Marshall, the revered Army Chief of Staff and Secretary of State who had been Eisenhower's mentor and champion. Senator Joseph McCarthy had viciously attacked Marshall, calling him part of a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. When Eisenhower campaigned in Wisconsin in October of 1952, he had initially planned to defend Marshall, but ultimately deleted the passage from his speech, yielding to political pressure from McCarthy's supporters. According to contemporary accounts in the New York Times, Truman viewed this act of cowardice as unforgivably, betrayal not just of Marshall, but of decency itself. The morning of the inauguration had begun with protocol requiring Eisenhower to pick up Truman at the White House for the traditional ride to the Capitol together. But even this simple courtesy had become a battlefield. Eisenhower refused to come inside the White House, instead waiting in his car. Truman, insulted by this breach of tradition, considered refusing to attend the ceremony altogether. His aides eventually persuaded him that such an absence would damage the presidency itself, not just his relationship with Eisenhower. During that awkward car ride to the Capitol, the two men barely spoke. Truman later recounted that Eisenhower asked who had ordered his son John to return from Korea for the inauguration. The question implied that Truman had used his presidential authority for political purposes to create a photo opportunity. Truman curtly replied that he had no idea, though it had likely been the Defense Department's routine protocol. The conversation died there, suffocated by mutual resentment. What made this estrangement particularly tragic was that these two men had once shared genuine respect and even friendship. Truman had considered Eisenhower a potential successor as early as 1958, even offering to support him for president if Eisenhower would run as a Democrat. They had worked together during the crucial post-war years, with Truman backing Eisenhower's military career and Eisenhower serving as Army Chief of Staff under Truman's administration. But politics has a way of poisoning even the strongest bonds. As Eisenhower descended into the partisan warfare of the 1952 campaign, allying himself with the Republican Party's most conservative and aggressive elements, Truman watched with growing disgust. The general he had once admired seemed to abandon his principles for political expediency. And Truman could not forgive what he saw as moral cowardice masquerading as pragmatism. The presidential campaign of 1952 had transformed American politics into something Truman found almost unrecognizable. By March of that year, Truman had announced he would not seek re-election, leaving the Democratic nomination open. Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois eventually secured the nomination. A man Truman respected but worried lacked the fighting spirit necessary to defeat the Republican machine. Eisenhower had been courted by both parties throughout the late 1940s. His immense popularity as supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, making him a prize catch for any political organization. When he finally declared himself a Republican in January of 1952, Truman felt betrayed, not because of the party choice itself, but because of what would follow. The Republican campaign unleashed what Truman considered a torrent of lies and distortions about his presidency. They blamed him personally for losing China to communism, as if one man could control the fate of the world's most populous nation. They accused his administration of harboring communist sympathizers, feeding into McCarthy's paranoid crusade. Most painfully, they blamed him for the stalemate in Korea, conveniently forgetting that Truman had made the agonizing decision to intervene to stop communist aggression in June of 1950. Eisenhower's campaign crafted the simple but devastating slogan, Korea, communism, and corruption, according to reporting from the Washington Post during that period. This three-pronged attack proved brutally effective, with voters exhausted by 3 years of war and anxious about Soviet expansion. Eisenhower promised to go to Korea himself to end the war, a pledge that seemed to diminish Truman's efforts and sacrifice. What Truman found most galling was Eisenhower's willingness to stand alongside politicians he had previously held in contempt. The general shared stages with isolationists he had once opposed, with McCarthy whose methods he privately deplored, and with conservative Republicans who had fought against the very internationalist policies Eisenhower himself had implemented as NATO's first supreme commander. The Marshall Incident in Milwaukee represented the moral nadir of the campaign for Truman. George Catlett Marshall had been perhaps the most distinguished American of his generation, Army Chief of Staff during World War II, architect of victory in Europe, Secretary of State who created the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, and Secretary of Defense during the Korean crisis. Marshall had personally selected Eisenhower from relative obscurity and promoted him over more than 300 senior officers to command Operation Overlord. Yet when McCarthy attacked Marshall as a traitor and communist dupe, Eisenhower remained silent when his voice mattered most. Truman had defended Marshall vigorously, calling him the greatest living American and a man of real honor. Eisenhower's silence felt like a knife in the back, not just to Marshall personally, but to everything Truman believed about loyalty, courage, and moral responsibility. The campaign also featured attacks on Truman's personal integrity. Republicans highlighted scandals involving some of his appointees, particularly a tax collection controversy and allegations of influence peddling by some officials. While Truman himself was never personally implicated in corruption, the mud splattered his reputation. He had always prided himself on his honesty and straightforward Missouri values, and these attacks wounded him deeply. Eisenhower's November victory was overwhelming. He won 13-9 states and 442 electoral votes to Stevenson's 18-9. But Truman saw the landslide not as a repudiation of Democratic policies, but as evidence of how effective negative campaigning and personality politics could be. He left office in January of 1953, feeling unappreciated and angry, convinced that Eisenhower had won through demagoguery rather than principle. The animosity between Truman and Eisenhower had roots that extended deeper than the 1952 campaign, reaching back to fundamental differences in temperament, background, and philosophy that the pressures of politics had merely exposed rather than created. Harry Truman came from Independence, Missouri, a small-town haberdasher who had entered politics through the Kansas City Democratic machine. He never attended college, instead educating himself through voracious reading of history and biography. His presidency had been accidentally thrust into office by Franklin Roosevelt's death in April of 1945 with almost no preparation, yet Truman had made monumentally difficult decisions with a decisiveness that sometimes bordered on stubbornness, dropping atomic bombs on Japan, implementing the Marshall Plan, recognizing Israel, desegregating the military, and intervening in Korea. Dwight Eisenhower, by contrast, represented the military establishment and had spent his entire adult life in the Army. Born in Texas, but raised in Abilene, Kansas, he had graduated from West Point in 1915. His rise through the ranks had been meteoric during World War II, and his success came partly from his remarkable ability to manage coalitions, smooth over disagreements, and maintain unity among strong personalities like George Patton, Bernard Montgomery, and Charles de Gaulle. These different paths shaped radically different leadership styles. Truman believed in decisiveness, clarity, and taking responsibility. "The buck stops here," read the famous sign on his Oval Office desk. He made decisions quickly, defended them vigorously, and rarely looked back. Eisenhower preferred consensus building, deliberation, what critics called hidden hand leadership, working behind the scenes, maintaining deniability, and projecting an image of being above partisan conflict while others did the political dirty work. Truman interpreted Eisenhower's approach as weakness and moral equivocation. The Marshall Incident exemplified this perfectly, rather than publicly defend his mentor against scurrilous attacks. Eisenhower had calculated that maintaining Republican unity mattered more than personal loyalty. Truman found this calculus reprehensible. He believed that some principles transcended political advantage, that character meant standing up for what was right regardless of cost. Eisenhower, for his part, viewed Truman as a political hack from a corrupt machine. someone who had stumbled into greatness without proper preparation or credentials. Despite Truman's significant achievements, Eisenhower privately dismissed him as unrefined and unsophisticated. According to historian David McCullough's research, Eisenhower's diary entries from this period reveal considerable condescension toward Truman's background and abilities. The Korea question particularly rankled both men. Truman had committed American forces to defend South Korea without a congressional declaration of war, acting under United Nations auspices but asserting broad presidential authority. When General Douglas MacArthur had publicly challenged his authority and advocated for expanding the war into China, Truman had fired him in April of 1950, one of the most controversial decisions of his presidency. Eisenhower had supported MacArthur's dismissal at the time, recognizing the constitutional necessity of civilian control over the military, but during the campaign he had softened his position, meeting with MacArthur and allowing supporters to suggest that his leadership would somehow produce victory where Truman had achieved only stalemate. This reversal infuriated Truman, who saw it as another example of Eisenhower sacrificing principle for political gain. The transition period between the November election and January inauguration had been tense and perfunctory. Truman offered the traditional briefings on national security and ongoing crises, but the meetings were cold and formal. Eisenhower showed little interest in Truman's insights, apparently convinced that he could learn what he needed from his own advisors. After January 20th, 1953, Harry Truman returned to Independence, Missouri, leaving Washington with none of the fanfare or continued influence that some former presidents enjoyed. He had no Secret Service protection that wouldn't become automatic for former presidents until 1958. He had no pension beyond his Army retirement pay of $112.50 per month. He had no office staff funded by the government, no library established, and no clear role in public life. Eisenhower moved into the White House and immediately began implementing policies that diverged from Truman's approach while paradoxically continuing many of his predecessors' fundamental strategies. The new president negotiated an armistice in Korea by July of 1953, fulfilling his campaign promise. Truman watched this development with mixed feelings, glad the killing had stopped, resentful that Eisenhower received credit for ending a war that Truman believed his own policies had contained. The Eisenhower administration maintained NATO, continued the Marshall Plan's successor programs, and preserved the basic architecture of containment that Truman had established. Yet Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, criticized Truman's approach as insufficiently aggressive, promoting instead the doctrine of massive retaliation and brinkmanship. They spoke of rolling back communism rather than merely containing it, though in practice they proved as cautious as Truman had been. In domestic policy, Eisenhower accepted the basic framework of the New Deal and Fair Deal, disappointing conservative Republicans who had hoped for dramatic reversals. He expanded Social Security, continued infrastructure projects, and maintained most of Truman's government structures. The irony was not lost on Truman. Eisenhower had campaigned against Trumanism but governed as a moderate who preserved Truman's legacy more than he dismantled it. Yet Eisenhower never acknowledged this continuity or accredited Truman's groundwork. No invitations came from the White House for Truman to visit, consult, or participate in ceremonies. When presidential libraries began to receive federal support through legislation Eisenhower signed in 1955, Truman benefited but without any personal reconciliation or recognition from the man who signed the bill. The McCarthy problem festered through Eisenhower's first term. The Wisconsin senator's reckless accusations continued to poison American politics, ruining careers and creating an atmosphere of paranoia. Eisenhower refused to directly confront McCarthy, claiming that he wouldn't get down in the gutter with that guy. Truman watched with disgust as McCarthy's witch hunts continued, feeling vindicated in his assessment of Eisenhower's moral courage or lack thereof. The situation came to a head during the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954, when McCarthy attacked the Army itself, accusing it of harboring communists. The televised hearings exposed McCarthy's bullying tactics to the American public, and his influence finally collapsed. The Senate censured him in December of 1954. Eisenhower had contributed to McCarthy's downfall through behind-the-scenes maneuvering, but he had never confronted him directly and publicly as Truman believed leadership required. Throughout these years, Truman worked on his memoirs, established his presidential library in Independence, and occasionally spoke out on political issues. He remained a Democrat in good standing, supporting Adlai Stevenson's second presidential campaign in 1956. The rematch between Stevenson and Eisenhower produced an even larger Republican victory, confirming Eisenhower's enormous popularity and suggesting that Americans had rejected not just Stevenson, but the entire Truman era. The lack of any contact between sitting and former president was unprecedented in modern American history. Previous presidents had maintained at least cordial relations with their successors, consulting occasionally on matters of state. But 8 years passed without Truman receiving a single invitation to the White House, and he would not have accepted if one had come. As Eisenhower's presidency continued through the mid-1950s, the contrast between his public image and Truman's assessment of his character only deepened. The American people adored Ike, seeing him as a grandfatherly figure who projected competence, stability, and warmth. His approval ratings remained remarkably high, and the nation prospered economically. The 1950s became synonymous with American confidence, suburban expansion, and the beginning of mass consumer culture. Truman watched this era unfold from independence with a complicated mixture of emotions. He genuinely wanted the country to succeed, yet he bristled at what he considered the unearned credit Eisenhower received. In Truman's view, the prosperity of the 50s rested on foundations he had laid. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe and created markets for American goods. The military buildup that created jobs and technological advancement, the infrastructure investments that enabled suburban development, and the containment policy that had prevented World War III. The civil rights issue represented another area where Truman felt Eisenhower's leadership was inadequate. Truman had desegregated the armed forces in 1948 through executive order, facing considerable political backlash but believing it was morally necessary. Eisenhower moved cautiously on civil rights, even privately expressing doubts about the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, which declared school segregation unconstitutional. When the Little Rock crisis erupted in September of 1957, Eisenhower finally acted decisively, sending federal troops to enforce integration at Central High School. Truman approved of the action, but believed Eisenhower should have provided moral leadership earlier, rather than waiting until defiance of federal authority forced his hand. The contrast in their approaches was clear. Truman led with conviction even when it was politically costly. Eisenhower followed public opinion and acted only when circumstances demanded. In foreign policy, the Eisenhower years saw several crises that tested the president's judgment. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt, forced Eisenhower to oppose his closest allies. Truman quietly approved of Eisenhower's handling of that situation, recognizing that American interests required opposing colonialism, even at the cost of Allied relations. Yet he never said so publicly, maintaining his stance that he would not offer support or criticism to the man who had treated him so contemptuously. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in October of 1957 shocked Americans and seemed to suggest that the United States was falling behind in technology and education. Eisenhower's relatively calm response, arguing that the satellite had no military significance, was probably correct, but seemed complacent to critics. Truman privately believed that more aggressive investment in science and education was necessary. But again, he kept his counsel to himself rather than enter a public debate about Eisenhower's leadership. Throughout these years, Truman's own reputation underwent reassessment. Historians began to take a more favorable view of his presidency, recognizing the courage required for his major decisions. The Marshall Plan was increasingly seen as a triumph of American statesmanship. The decision to intervene in Korea, while still controversial, was viewed by many scholars as having successfully prevented communist expansion. Even the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan, while forever debated, was understood in the context of avoiding a ground invasion that might have cost millions of lives. Yet this historical rehabilitation brought Truman little satisfaction regarding his relationship with Eisenhower. Recognition from scholars and the gradual appreciation of his achievements did not compensate for what he perceived as Eisenhower's betrayal of principles and personal disloyalty. The wound remained fresh, perhaps even deepened by the contrast between his growing historical stature and the way Eisenhower's administration ignored and diminished him. By the late 1950s, the estrangement between Truman and Eisenhower had become an established fact of American political life. Journalists occasionally noted the absence of any contact, but most coverage focused on the surface explanation, partisan differences, and campaign bitterness. Few understood the depth of Truman's personal sense of betrayal or the extent to which Eisenhower dismissed his predecessor as unworthy of respect. The Democratic Party tried occasionally to use Truman's continuing popularity among loyal Democrats, while also attempting to move beyond the controversies of his presidency. The party faced a delicate balance. Truman remained beloved by many working-class voters and party activists, but suburban moderates associated him with the conflicts and anxieties of the early Cold War. Democrats seeking to win back the White House needed to honor Truman while not being too closely tied to his record. Truman himself remained active in Democratic politics, though without formal position or authority. He worked on his presidential library, which opened in Independence in July of 1957. The dedication ceremony featured prominent Democrats, but no Republicans of note, and certainly no message from the sitting president. Eisenhower's absence from the dedication, he sent no representative, and no congratulatory message was noted by observers as a extenuating symbol of the breach between the two men. The Truman Library became Harry's primary project and legacy. He established it as a research center for scholars studying the presidency and the immediate post-war period. He donated his papers, maintained an office there, and regularly spoke with researchers and visitors. The library represented his attempt to shape how history would remember his presidency, to ensure that future generations understood the context and reasoning behind his controversial decisions. During this period, Truman also became increasingly outspoken in his criticisms of Eisenhower, though he usually avoided personal attacks and focused on policy disagreements. He gave speeches and wrote articles arguing that the administration's massive retaliation doctrine was dangerous and that its budget cuts to conventional forces were short-sighted. He criticized what he saw as insufficient attention to domestic needs in education, healthcare, and civil rights. These critiques irritated Eisenhower, who viewed them as carping from a failed president trying to salvage his reputation. Eisenhower's own memoirs, which he began planning during his second term, would treat Truman dismissively, focusing on the problems he inherited rather than acknowledging any achievements or wise policies from the previous administration. The two men were writing competing narratives of recent American history, each diminishing the other's contributions. The election of 1960 brought new dynamics to American politics. Vice President Richard Nixon won the Republican nomination, running essentially as Eisenhower's heir. The Democrats nominated Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, a young Catholic who represented a generational change. Truman initially supported Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri, but eventually backed Kennedy, though with some reservations about his youth and his father's controversial past. Truman campaigned for Kennedy with his characteristic bluntness, attacking Nixon's record and defending Democratic achievements. His presence on the campaign trail reminded voters of the party's recent history and provided a link to the Roosevelt-Truman era for older voters. Yet his role was supporting rather than central. The campaign belonged to a new generation, and Truman accepted that his time had passed. Kennedy's narrow victory in November of 1960 meant that a Democrat would return to the White House in January of 1961. For Truman, this transition represented an opportunity. Perhaps the end of the Eisenhower era would also mean the end of his exile from the White House. Surely, President-elect Kennedy would invite him to the inauguration, to White House ceremonies, to consultations on policy. The 8 years of silence might finally end, though not through reconciliation with Eisenhower but through his departure. January 20th, 1961 brought a remarkable contrast to the bitter inauguration 8 years earlier. Harry Truman sat on the inaugural platform in prominent position, wrapped against the cold. Watching John Fitzgerald Kennedy deliver his stirring address about passing the torch to a new generation, symbolism was powerful. The Democratic Party spanning generations from Truman to Kennedy, from the immediate post-war world to the space age. Unlike Eisenhower, Kennedy understood the importance of honoring predecessors and maintaining institutional continuity. Within weeks of taking office, he invited Truman to the White House for lunch and consultation. The visit in March of 1961 marked Truman's first return to the executive mansion since he had walked out on Inauguration Day 1953. Photographers captured him standing in the Oval Office, clearly emotional at being back in the place where he had made such momentous decisions. Kennedy was gracious and genuinely interested in Truman's insights. They discussed Cuba, where the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion would soon occur, and Berlin, where Soviet pressure was mounting. Truman's advice was characteristically direct. Be clear about American commitments, don't bluff, and be prepared to use force if necessary to defend vital interests. Kennedy listened respectfully, though he would make his own decisions informed by his own advisors and circumstances. The restoration of Truman's access to the White House represented more than personal reconciliation. It reflected a different understanding of the presidency itself. Kennedy saw value in consulting former presidents regardless of party, recognizing that the unique pressures and responsibilities of the office created a fellowship that transcended partisan politics. He would later also invite Eisenhower to the White House for consultations, particularly during international crises. Eisenhower's own departure from office had been somewhat ambiguous. His farewell address in January of 1961, warning about the military-industrial complex, surprised many observers and suggested a more critical view of American defense policy than he had expressed during his presidency. Truman found the speech ironic. The former general warning about military influence seemed rich, coming from someone who had overseen massive defense budgets and nuclear weapons buildup. In retirement, Eisenhower settled on his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, just 70 miles from Washington. Unlike Truman's complete estrangement from power, Eisenhower remained influential in Republican politics and maintained high public regard. His memoirs, published in 1963 and 1965, were widely read and shaped public understanding of the 1950s. Truman's own presence in public life continued through the Kennedy and Johnson years, supported Kennedy's initiatives, including civil rights legislation and the space program. After Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, mourned genuinely, having developed real affection for the young president who had treated him with respect and consulted him seriously. President Lyndon Johnson, who had served in Congress during Truman's presidency, maintained the practice of consulting him. Johnson visited Independence, called Truman for advice on Vietnam and domestic policy, and publicly honored him at ceremonies. The signing of Medicare into law in July of 1965 took place at the Truman Library, with Truman and his wife Bess receiving the first Medicare cards in recognition of Truman's early advocacy for national health insurance. Yet throughout all these years of restored access and honor, Truman never reconciled with Eisenhower. They attended some of the same public events, Kennedy's funeral, brought them together at Washington National Cathedral, but they did not speak beyond minimal courtesies. The wound had never healed because neither man had sought healing. Truman believed he had nothing to apologize for, and Eisenhower saw no reason to acknowledge any wrongdoing. The breach between Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower continued through the 1960s until it was overtaken by age and failing health. Truman, born in 1884, remained remarkably active well into his 80s, walking daily around Independence and maintaining interest in current affairs. Eisenhower, born in 1890, suffered several heart attacks and declining health that limited his activities. In 1964, the passage of time began to soften some perspectives. Herbert Hoover, the last living former president besides Truman and Eisenhower, died in October of that year at age 90. His death left only 3 living former presidents, a reminder of mortality and the fleeting nature of political conflicts. Yet even this moment produced no reconciliation between Truman and Eisenhower, who attended Hoover's funeral separately and maintained their distance. The Johnson administration's escalation in Vietnam created an interesting dynamic. Both Truman and Eisenhower supported the war effort, believing that American credibility required preventing a communist victory in South Vietnam, yet their reasoning differed. Truman saw it as necessary containment consistent with his doctrine, while Eisenhower viewed it through the lens of maintaining American military prestige. They agreed on policy but never used this agreement as grounds for personal rapprochement. By the late 1960s, historians and journalists began examining the Truman-Eisenhower relationship more systematically. The publication of presidential papers, memoirs by former officials, and interviews with participants revealed the depth of the personal animosity. The Marshall Incident received particular attention, with many historians concluding that Truman's assessment had been largely correct. Eisenhower had sacrificed principle for political advantage in failing to defend his mentor. Eisenhower's health deteriorated seriously after 1968. He suffered multiple heart attacks and spent long periods in Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Reports of his declining condition brought no olive branch from Truman, who maintained his position that the breach was Eisenhower's responsibility to repair. Truman's own health remained relatively good until a fall in his home in 1964 that began a slower decline. Dwight Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, at age 78. Harry Truman, then 84, issued a brief statement expressing condolences to the Eisenhower family and acknowledging his service to the nation. The statement was correct and proper, but notably lacking in warmth or personal reflection. Truman attended the funeral at Washington National Cathedral, sitting with other former presidents and dignitaries. But he offered no eulogy and made no public comments beyond his written statement. With Eisenhower's death, any possibility of reconciliation ended. Truman lived another 3.5 years, dying on December 26, 1972, at age 88. His passing marked the end of the generation that had led America through World War II and the early Cold War. President Richard Nixon, who had served as Eisenhower's vice president, attended Truman's funeral and delivered remarks praising his courage and decisiveness. The historical judgment on both men has evolved considerably since their deaths. Truman is now regularly rated among the near-great presidents, praised for his courage in making difficult decisions and for establishing the framework of American Cold War strategy that ultimately proved successful. The Marshall Plan, NATO, containment, and intervention in Korea are seen as far-sighted policies that prevented Soviet expansion and created the conditions for eventual Western victory in the Cold War. Eisenhower's reputation has also risen, with historians appreciating his steady leadership during dangerous times. His success in ending the Korean War, his restraint in avoiding unnecessary military interventions, and his management of Cold War tensions, his farewell address warning about the military-industrial complex, is now seen as prescient. Many scholars argue that his hidden-hand leadership style was more effective than critics at the time recognized. Yet the personal breach between these two consequential presidents remains a cautionary tale about how pride, perceived betrayal, and unwillingness to forgive can prevent collaboration between people who shared fundamental commitments to American security and prosperity. 8 years, during which a former president never visited the White House, stands as a unique episode in American history, a testament to how deeply personal wounds can override institutional norms and shared purposes. The story of why Truman never visited the White House during Eisenhower's 8 years in office ultimately reveals the humanity of even our most consequential leaders. These were not perfect men, but complex human beings, whose achievements were remarkable precisely because they came despite personal flaws, grudges, and limitations. Their inability to reconcile diminished both of them personally, even as their separate contributions to American history remained significant and lasting.